The battle between the Empire's soldier, the Imperial Guard, and enemies began with chaos filling the air. The Empire's soldiers that everything they did was for the Empire, to eliminate enemies who threatened the Emperor and the people. Without hesitation, they raised their guns and fired a rain of bullets toward the alone guard standing before them. The Imperial Guard, the bullets rushed toward him, cutting through the air like deadly arrows, but he showed no fear. In his hands he held a gun unlike any other. A powerful energy beam burst forth from his weapon, striking the bullets mid-air. In an instant, their direction shifted, and they spun back toward those who had fired them. The Empire's people had no time to react as the bullets pierced through their foreheads, ending their lives in an instant. One by one, they collapsed, their bodies falling motionless onto the ground. The battlefield grew silent. In the distant future, the world had changed beyond recognition. Technology had advanced beyond imagination, but humanity had not found peace. Endless wars raged on, fueled by the desperate struggle for limited resources. Earth itself suffered under the weight of destruction, and when an unknown alien species invaded, it marked the final blow. The once thriving planet could no longer sustain life, and the survivors had no choice but to abandon their home. They drifted through space, searching endlessly for a new beginning. After what felt like an eternity, they finally discovered a planet similar to Earth. It was a world untouched by war. With hope in their hearts, they named it Novice, meaning new home. A signal was sent across the galaxy, calling all surviving humans to gather at Novice. Slowly, they made their way toward this new planet, a place where they could rebuild what was lost. But peace was never easy to achieve. 3 great factions emerged, each with its own power and influence. The Bellato Federation was a diverse group where humans and aliens coexisted, using advanced technology to strengthen their civilization. The Accretion Empire, on the other hand, focused on building a powerful army. Their soldiers were not ordinary men but warriors with machine-enhanced bodies, making them nearly unstoppable in battle. Lastly, the Holy Korite Alliance was a mysterious group led by priests who possessed the ability to control force energy, and had unmatched mental strength. Despite their differences, all 3 factions faced the same harsh truth because Novice had limited resources. It was only a matter of time before greed and ambition led to yet another war. Humanity, once forced to flee due to endless conflicts, now found itself preparing for battle once again. Deep within the Accretion Empire, sterile laboratory known as the Accretion Machination Lab, a young trainee stood in beside of a commanding figure. The air was thick with tension as the old man's voice rang out with authority. He was Commander Hamilas Custoria, a leader feared and respected within the Empire. His gaze was fixed on the boy before him. The boy had been chosen for an important test, one that would determine his worth. With a serious expression, the commander reminded him that luck was not on his side. He was bound to be compared to others, judged for his every action. This was the moment where he had to prove his strength to His Majesty. He was ordered not to forget that this day would define his future. The boy, though nervous but his voice was steady as he responded, unwilling to accept defeat before the battle had even begun. He made it clear that he would not be the unlucky one. His name was Luca, a trainee of the Accretion Imperial Guard. As he turned away, the commander's voice cut through the silence once more. He asked for Luca's name, and Luca was expected to meet the high standards of the Empire. The weight of expectation pressed down on the young trainee. Luca nodded with determination, his voice firm as he accepted his fate. He knew there was no room for failure. As he prepared for the fight, he took a deep breath and reached for his helmet. His mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. Worry settled in his chest, but he pushed it aside. He reminded himself that he had to be capable of dodging and blocking bullets. It was not just a skill but a requirement to become an official member of the Imperial Guards. Every soldier had to master it. He recalled his intense training, where he had completed countless simulation exercises in the harshest conditions. He was not just any trainee, he had undergone the reinforcement procedure that heightened his spatial awareness. His senses and perception had been sharpened, allowing him to react faster and process movement more effectively. His mind drifted to his upcoming fight. He was not facing ordinary opponents. His enemies were 5 death row inmates, criminals who had been given cheap cybernetic upgrades. He calculated the time it would take to defeat them as just 10 seconds. That was all he needed. It should have been a simple task, but this battle was different. The Emperor would be watching. This was Luca's chance to prove himself. If he wanted to stand out, he had to do something remarkable. Doubt crept into his mind. He had never done anything extraordinary before. Could he truly achieve something that would make a lasting impression? His sharp eyes scanned his own body. He focused on his hands, his teeth, his breath. He knew that every part of him needed to be at its peak. His heart pounded as he came to a realization. He had to push his senses to the absolute maximum. If he wanted to survive, he had to surpass his limits. Luca was now in the middle of fight, using his gun's beam to change the direction of the bullets fired at him. Each time an attack came his way, he redirected it, causing the bullets to bounce off the walls instead of hitting him. His movements were sharp, precise, and faster. The fight was intense, but he remained focused. Commander Hamilas watched him closely, his sharp eyes filled with approval. He had not expected Luca to handle the battle with such skill. The fight finally came to an end. Around Luca, bodies lay motionless on the ground, a deep pool of blood forming beneath them. The once loud battlefield was now silent. Luca stood in the center by using his sword to support himself as exhaustion weighed on him. He removed his helmet, but his breath was heavy. Blood dripped down from his nose, but he did not care. He had done it. He had surpassed his limits. This fight had surely raised his value in the eyes of the Empire. As he wiped the blood from his face with his hand, he turned toward the commander. Hamilas looked at him with a knowing smile, his voice filled with both amusement and curiosity. He admitted that he had not expected Luca to use ballistic trajectory control, a technique that should not have been part of his training yet. Luca shrugged off the compliment as if it was nothing. He casually admitted that he had simply copied someone who had fought before him. The commander's smile grew slightly sarcastic as he explained the truth. The person Luca had copied was from a well-known household, someone who had already been trained in the advanced curriculum before even joining the Imperial Guards. That trainee had an advantage from birth, something Luca did not have. Hamilas reminded Luca of his own background, that he was just an orphan, someone with no powerful family behind him. And yet, despite that, he had managed to stand out. The commander's expression softened slightly as he spoke again. He told Luca that he liked him, that he had potential. Because of that, he would give him a gift. Luca turned his head toward the commander, confusion clear in his eyes. What kind of gift? He repeated the words in his mind, unsure of what the commander meant. Commander Hamilas suddenly reached out, grabbing Luca's face with one hand. Before Luca could react, the commander forcefully widened his eyelid, his grip firm. In a swift motion, he pulled out Luca's eye. Blood immediately began dripping down from the empty socket, trailing down Luca's cheek and onto the ground. However, Luca did not scream, nor did he show any sign of pain. His face remained unreadable, his expression cold and unmoving. The other trainee present there were shocked. The commander held Luca's eye and clenching his fist. With a crushing force, he destroyed it completely, letting the blood fall from his fingers. He studied Luca's reaction, expecting a response, but there was none. Instead, he smirked and spoke with approval. Luca had not been fazed at all. It was clear that he had done exceptionally well in his pain tolerance training. The commander liked that about him. Luca, still expressionless despite much blood pouring from his empty socket, simply responded. His voice was calm, though sweat had begun to form on his face. He admitted that he was glad. That eye had been one he planned to remove eventually anyway. Without hesitation, he made a request. He wanted a replacement eye with the ability to predict trajectories. Meanwhile, in another scene, a boy appeared with a friendly expression. He waved his hand with a firm smile, his energy bright and confident. He introduced himself as number 12, Ailey. He had come specifically to talk to number 32, Luca. Luca, who had been sitting on his bed. He looked up in shock, his lips slightly parted in confusion. He was not wearing his upper body cover, though his arms remained covered. The sudden visit left him unsure of how to respond. Ailey quickly noticed Luca's reaction and rubbed the back of his neck nervously. His voice was apologetic as he asked if he had been too sudden. He had not meant to surprise Luca. After a brief pause, Luca gave his permission. His voice was calm as he told Ailey to come in. Ailey sat comfortably on his bed, a confident smile on his face. He looked at Luca and spoke with admiration. "You were really good back there. I was impressed." His tone was light, but there was sincerity in his words. Luca's face giving away nothing and unreadable. He replied without any emotion. "You are in the wrong place if you wish to exchange praises, young master." His voice was calm, but there was a hidden sharpness in his words. Ailey observed him closely, his smile firm as he thought to himself. Looks like it will be really hard to become your friend. There was a challenge in his gaze, but also curiosity. Luca, on the other hand, his mind filled with thoughts as he looked at Ailey. Ailey Karthika, with just his aura, I can tell that he is the son of the famous noble household, Karthika. Logically speaking, there is no need for me to be so aggressive to someone from a noble household. Ailey, catching the tension between them, he thought with a determined expression. Let's see. He wanted to test Luca, to understand him better. Luca, however, continued his own thoughts. I guess you can chalk it up to envy, but let's just say that I am tired for now. With a convincing smile, Ailey moved his hand forward, revealing a small dark blue pill resting in his palm, and spoke in a calm voice. Here. Luca glanced at the pill, then at Ailey, waiting for an explanation. Ailey met his gaze and continued, I came to give you this. It will decrease your sensitivity, so that you can rest better. Luca showed no reaction to the small pill in Ailey's hand. He spoke with carelessness that I do not need it. He made no move to accept the offer, his posture showing that he had already made up his mind. Ailey, however, did not lower his hand. You will not be able to train well tomorrow if you do not get a good rest. You should be well aware that mental fortitude can't carry you through everything. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable logic. He was not forcing Luca, but he also was not letting the matter go. Luca looked at him for a moment. He had not expected this from Ailey. He thought, realizing something. It is different from those knockoffs made in the streets. Luca shifted the conversation, speaking in a casual tone. You were pretty good too, Ailey. I just copied you. Ailey, however, pointed toward his light blue eye and spoke with a confident expression. I have a mechanical eye for combat, so it is not hard to calculate trajectory. Your actions were much more impressive since you pulled it off with just your instincts. He leaned slightly forward, his tone filled with curiosity and amusement. It seemed like the commander took notice of you, and irregular too. I assume that is why he is gifting you a mechanical eye out of his own pocket. Luca replied with honesty, his voice quiet yet firm. I just tried really hard throughout the training. Nobility is excellent while the lower classes are powerless, after all. I cannot let go of a rare opportunity like this as a lower-class citizen. His words carried the weight of reality, the truth of the world he lived in. He was not going to waste a single chance, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. Ailey's brows furrowed slightly as he repeated the words with confusion. Nobility is excellence. His voice carried doubt as he looked at Luca and asked in a serious tone. You may have passed the selection process, but you know there are guys who failed it, do not you? I bet there are people who paid money to manipulate the results. Luca considered the possibility and nodded. That is possible. His voice remained calm, but he did not deny the reality of corruption. Ailey spoke with certainty. There is no proof, but it is something I strongly believe. Those like you, without any support system, have never failed the advanced soldier cultivation process. Because it means that you guys made it here with just your skill. His words were firm, showing his belief in those who had no choice but to rely on their own strength. Luca listened carefully, and for the first time, he felt something shift in his thoughts. He had never expected a noble to tell him that not all nobles were excellent. He thought to himself, feeling a strange sense of respect growing for Ailey. I never considered this. What does this guy want to tell me? His mind searched for an answer, but he could not fully grasp Ailey's intentions yet. Ailey, however, made things clear. His firm smile remained as he extended his hand toward Luca, his eyes filled with sincerity. Luca, I think people like you are the ones who should succeed. I will be cheering you on. His voice carried no arrogance, only genuine encouragement. Luca felt a moment of confusion. He was not used to such words, especially from a noble. But after a brief hesitation, he slowly moved his hand forward, meeting Ailey's in a firm handshake, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A silent understanding, perhaps even the beginning of mutual respect. Luca's eyes held determination as he spoke. I plan on it. This is all for the Empire. Ailey's expression shifted, his usual confident smile replaced by a more serious look. This story follows the chronicles of a boy being raised as a military weapon in the tyrannical empire, Acretia. Planet Novus, a planet similar to Earth, was divided into three powerful forces. They were the Free Belations in the Federation, the Acretian Empire, and the Holy Korite Alliance. Each force had its own beliefs, its own strength, and its own ambitions. Luca and Ailey stood side by side in the training area, their guns in hand as they prepared to practice. Luca, who had recently received a mechanical eye transplant, took careful aim at Thin, the training dummy. His eye adjusted automatically, helping him calculate the perfect shot. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. A series of loud gunshots echoed through the space as the bullets tore through the air and struck Thin's forehead with deadly accuracy. Each shot hit the same spot, creating multiple holes in the dummy's head. Ailey watched the entire scene unfold, his eyes filled with admiration. He smiled, clearly impressed, and praised Luca's skills. He pointed out that Luca had managed to shoot all the targets square in the head without missing a single shot. He then commented that as the top student, Luca truly seemed different from the rest. Curious, he asked if Luca had already gotten used to his newly transplanted right eye. It amazed him how quickly Luca was adapting to his enhanced vision. However, Ailey could not help but tease him a little, saying that it was unfair for someone who specialized in close combat to be this good with a gun. Luca, however, remained serious. He responded in a firm tone, explaining that as a member of the guards, it was only natural for him to be skilled in using all types of weapons. He did not believe in relying on just one specialty. Then, turning the conversation back at Ailey, he pointed out that Ailey had no right to make such comments when he himself had shown incredible shooting skills. After all, Ailey had managed to shoot every single bullet through the same hole, proving his own level of mastery with guns. Ailey simply laughed at Luca's words, brushing them off casually. He ran a hand through his hair, his usual confident smirk on his face. He admitted that his specialty just happened to be with guns. But Luca's sharp eyes stared at Ailey. He then warned Ailey that if he continued to be so nonchalant about training, Luca would eventually surpass him. His words carried a strong sense of confidence, showing that he had no intention of staying behind in terms of skill. Ailey stood with a firm smile on his face as he responded to Luca's warning without hesitation. He welcomed the idea of Luca surpassing him, and reminded him that he had always been rooting for him. Ailey believed that the Empire needed people like Luca, individuals with true ability and talent. However, he expressed his frustration with how the Empire functioned. In his eyes, the value of skill was slowly being diluted. It no longer mattered how talented or capable a person was. As long as someone held status and power, even the weak could be considered talented. But he was hopeful. If more naturally gifted individuals like Luca continued to appear, people would eventually learn to distinguish between those who truly had talent and those who simply relied on their social standing. Luca listened carefully, but his expression darkened. His jaw clenched, and there was a hint of anger in his voice as he spoke. He addressed Ailey by name in a serious tone, making it clear that his words sounded dangerously close to criticizing the Empire's system. If Luca were to report exactly what Ailey had just said to headquarters, there would be consequences, even for someone as highly regarded as a Karthika. The Empire did not take kindly to such remarks, and Ailey could easily get into serious trouble. Ailey, however, remained unfazed. He simply turned away with a careless smile, showing no signs of concern. He casually pointed out that if Luca had truly intended to report him, he would not have warned him about it first. It was obvious that Luca was a good person, and deep down, Ailey knew that Luca cared about him. With a light-hearted tone, he thanked Luca for worrying about him. Luca, on the other hand, was left frustrated. He tightened his grip on his gun, both hands holding it firmly, as he watched Ailey's back. The way Ailey brushed off the situation so easily made frustrated. He could do nothing but mutter to himself in irritation, calling Ailey annoying as the conversation came to an end. 2 years into their training, during the third quarter, all the trainees sat in formation, facing the commander. His voice was firm, filled with authority, as he made an important announcement. Luca and Ailey had been chosen as platoon leaders for this training mission. He made it clear that if any trainee had an issue with this decision, they were free to stand up and leave. However, no one dared to object. The commander then moved on, explaining their mission. Across the gorge, there was a Korite outpost that had been illegally stationed within their territories. This mission was designed to test their abilities in a real combat situation. His expression darkened as he gave his final order. There was no need for prisoners. Their objective was simple: to kill them all. His words left no room for hesitation. Later, the trainees stood before the gorge, staring at the enemy outpost. The air was tense, the weight of the mission heavy on their shoulders. Ailey, standing among them, acknowledged the situation with a simple statement. This was their first real mission. Luca, standing beside him, glanced his way and asked if he was nervous. He reminded Ailey that he had already killed people during training, implying that this mission should be no different. But Ailey shook his head slightly as he explained his thoughts. This time, they were not fighting within the controlled environment of training exercises. For the first time, they were facing an outside force, real enemies from powerful factions. He mentioned the Beladian Federation, the Holy Korite Alliance, and even the Accretion Empire. All of them, despite being enemies now, shared a common ancestry as descendants of humanity from planet Earth. Luca looked at Ailey, his expression firm as he reminded him not to get lost in his emotions. This was not the time for hesitation. His sharp eyes shifted toward the towering figures of the senior guards, covered in their full-body mechanical armor. Their presence was unsettling, not because they were there for protection, but because they were there to supervise. Luca doubted that the senior guards cared about their safety. In fact, he was certain that if any of them attempted to take prisoners instead of following orders, the guards might not hesitate to eliminate them. Luca agreed with the harsh reality they had been taught: those who did not understand their place had no right to be part of the Imperial Guard. On planet Novice, the Empire saw every other force as nothing more than insects. They had learned this through their training. The world was full of deception, and every faction outside the Empire only sought to use it for their own benefit. Ailey lowered his gaze slightly, his voice filled with disappointment as he admitted that he already knew all of this. It was what they had been taught from the beginning. The battle erupted. Gunfire filled the air as bullets rained down on the enemy outposts. The sound of gunshots echoed through the battlefield, followed by screams and chaos. Flames spread quickly, engulfing everything in their path. The Korite soldiers fell one by one, their bodies collapsing lifelessly onto the ground as the trainees carried out their orders. Luca gripped his sword tightly, his sharp mind assessing the situation. None of the Korite soldiers seemed to be armed. That meant the battle would end without much resistance. Just as he was about to move forward, his eyes landed on a small figure. A child sat on the ground, trembling behind a broken wall. His small frame was curled up in fear, surrounded by flames. Luca pointed his sword at him, ready to follow orders. But then, he heard something that made him freeze. The child's weak, broken voice called out for his mother. His tiny hands covered his face as he sobbed. Luca looked at the child, his mind racing. The boy was terrified, too scared to even move. He was just a defenseless non-combatant, offering no resistance. Luca clenched his teeth in frustration. If only he had a gun, he could make this quick. But all he had was his sword. The child slowly moved his shaking hands away from his tear-streaked face. His fearful eyes locked onto Luca, filled with silent pleading. He wiped his tears with his small hands. But then, Luca's mind flashed back to the commander's orders that had been drilled into him. There was no need for prisoners. Kill them all. Do not hesitate. They are nothing but insects draining the Empire's resources. Luca tightened his grip on his sword, his muscles tense. He lifted the weapon, preparing to strike. The words of the commander echoed in his head, pushing him forward. The child remained frozen, unable to react. Luca swung his sword downward then, in an instant, something inside him snapped. His hands released the weapon. The child sat in confusion, unsure of what had just happened. He looked up at Luca with wide and disbelieving eyes. Luca spoke in a quiet but firm voice, telling the boy to play dead. It was the only chance he had to survive. The child did not move, still in shock. Luca turned away, his heart pounding. His mind screamed at him, filled with doubt. He knew what he had just done was dangerous. If headquarters ever found out about his actions, he had no idea what consequences he would face. He started walking away, but a thought lingered in his mind. Should he turn back and should he make sure the boy was safe? Before he could decide, a sudden beam of energy shot through the air. The attack hit the child directly in the face. Luca's breath caught in his throat as he looked up toward the source of the beam. His eyes widened in shock when he saw Ailey sitting high up on a pillar, his rifle still aimed downward. Luca's mind raced as he struggled to process what had just happened. Ailey? Since when was he there? Had he been watching everything? Luca's heart pounded as he forced himself to stay calm. He told himself that Ailey would not report his hesitation. However, if any of the other trainees had seen what happened, things could turn dangerous. He needed to keep an eye on Ailey. Before Luca could gather his thoughts, a sudden explosion tore through the air. His body tensed as he saw an attack coming straight for Ailey's position. Without thinking, Luca shouted his name in alarm. Ailey barely had time to react before the blast struck near him, shaking the pillar he was on. A furious voice boomed from the battlefield. An old man stood among the flames, his body crackling with energy flowing around his hands. His face twisted with rage as he glared at them. He roared, "Go to hell, you accretions!" Luca spun around to face the man, gripping his sword tightly. His mind struggled to make sense of the situation. Had this old man just caused that explosion? He had no weapons, yet he had unleashed a powerful attack. If he could do this with his bare hands, then before Luca could act, Ailey moved. He jumped from the pillar, positioning himself to attack the old man from behind. But that moment the old man turned with unnatural speed, unleashing a forceful attack in return. Luca's eyes widened in shock, his teeth clenched. Force. This man was a force user. That explained everything: the explosions, the unnatural power, the way he fought without weapons. The old man's furious gaze locked onto Luca. His voice was filled with pain and anger as he pointed toward him. "This is not a base. It is a settlement. The people you killed were just trying to survive." Luca stood at the front behind him. The trainees stood ready, gripping their weapons tightly. His thoughts were in chaos. Did the captain know about this? If they had been given this information earlier, Ailey could have prepared, and Luca himself could have reacted better to the explosions. His mind burned with frustration. His teeth clenched in anger as he forced himself to focus. He would have preferred a long, strategic battle, but there was no time for that. He had no other choice. Even though his body would not be able to handle high-speed movements for too long, he had to strike now while he still had the advantage. He needed to move faster. Without hesitation, Luca charged toward the old man, his sword ready. The enemy, filled with rage, stood his ground, preparing to meet Luca's attack head-on. Their battle was about to begin. Meanwhile, Ailey lay on the ground, his body broken beyond recognition. His arms were torn apart, scattered around him. Despite his unbearable pain, he forced himself to speak. His voice was weak but steady as he admitted his mistake. "Luca, I let my guard down. I have no excuses." Luca responded firmly, assuring Ailey that he would handle the fight. He told him to rest, knowing there was nothing Ailey could do in his condition. But inside, Luca's emotions churned with guilt as he blamed himself for what had happened. His hesitation had caused this disaster. He had been trained countless times on how to deal with a force user. He knew the techniques, the strategies, but when the moment came, he had hesitated. Luca turned to the trainees and gave a direct order. He would handle the enemy. The rest of them were to disperse and take control of the base. Without question, the trainees obeyed, quickly moving out. Now, the battlefield belonged to Luca and the force user. The old man gathered energy in his hand, his body crackling with power. His rage burned as he saw the trainees begin to disappear fast. "Where do you think you are going, you bastards?" His voice was filled with desperation. Luca's sharp eyes observed every movement of the old man, analyzing his actions. He quickly realized what was happening. The old man was trying to buy time for his allies to escape. He was acting as bait, drawing their attention while the others fled. Luca knew that force users required a preparatory action to activate their abilities, and in this man's case, it was the formation of hand signs. Luca could spot the disruption in space caused by the energy buildup. Seizing the moment, Luca launched his attack. His speed was unmatched as he closed the distance between them. His sword moved in a blur, aiming straight for the old man. "I got him," Luca thought, confident in his strike. But then something strange happened. The old man, instead of defending, raised his energy-filled hand and pressed it against the cover of Luca's face. The force of the energy shattered half of it. Blood dripped from old man's mouth, and tears welled in his eyes, rolling down his cheeks. Luca's eyes widened in shock. His mind reeled as he tried to understand what had just happened. Death, but how? The old man gasped, his voice filled with pain and sorrow as he looked at Luca. His hands trembled. He managed to speak. "You are just a child." His voice carried neither hatred nor anger, only sadness. Luca's grip on his sword tightened as his heart pounded. Without hesitation, he pushed the blade deeper into the old man's body. The force of the strike sent the man backward. His body shifted into a lifeless position, landing on the ground. The battlefield was silent for a moment. Luca stood there, his own breath heavy, looking at the fallen man. The fight was over. But those last words lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. If the old man had gone through with his attack, Luca would have been dead. Korite warriors were known to be fanatics, willing to sacrifice everything for their cause. They never hesitated. They never held back. So why had this man failed to kill him? His thoughts swirled with confusion, but he quickly pushed them away. He could not afford to let emotions consume him. Move. Stay focused. This was all for the Empire. The Imperial Guard existed to eliminate threats, to protect the Emperor and the people. Nothing else mattered. That was the only truth he needed to believe in. Then, suddenly, a weak, painful moan broke through the silence. Luca's eyes widened in shock as he turned toward the source of the sound. Someone was still alive. His sharp gaze scanned the battlefield, trying to find where the voice had come from. The moaning continued, low and filled with agony. The recovery room in Accretion Hospital was dimly lit, filled with the steady hum of machines and the faint bubbling of the thick, healing solution. Luca and Ailey lay in separate chambers, their bodies suspended in the liquid, connected to wires and tubes that worked to repair the damage they had suffered. Their chambers were placed side by side, allowing them to see each other. Ailey turned his head slightly toward Luca, his expression filled with curiosity as he asked with a teasing tone how it felt to almost die. Luca smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he replied that Ailey should speak for himself because it was him who had almost died. Ailey laughed, his voice echoing softly in the quiet room, and told Luca that he had received new arms and legs this time. There was a strange excitement in his tone, as if the idea of replacing his body parts had become something normal. He then asked how many body parts he had changed. Luca let out a tired sigh and explained that his back had been completely destroyed, so he had received titanium bones and artificial skin. He would eventually end up with a completely new body in a few years anyway, so he might as well get the replacements a little early. There was no fear or sadness in his voice, only acceptance of the reality they lived in. Ailey's eyes shifted toward Luca with a thoughtful expression before he spoke again. As he pointed out that their boss had probably known about the presence of a Force user. His eyes darkened slightly as he realized the truth behind their silence, saying that the reason they had not heard anything about it was because it had been a test. As Ailey spoke, Luca suddenly interrupted, his voice steady but carrying a hint of frustration. He continued talking, pointing out how none of their seniors had stepped in to help during the fight. That meant their superiors had believed they could handle it on their own. He reasoned that, in the end, no one had died in action, which was strange. Luca's eyes darkened with thought as he recalled the battle, realizing something odd. He and the other cadet who had taken the Force attack head-on had both survived. That was too strange to be a coincidence. His voice grew heavier, as he suggested that maybe the Force user had never intended to kill them in the first place. A sudden memory flashed in Luca's mind, an old man, moments before his death, looking at him with an expression he could not quite understand. The old man's final words echoed in his head as he asked him in disbelief if he was just a kid. Luca clenched his teeth, his jaw tightening with anger. In his mind, he argued with the man, thinking bitterly that he was no longer a child. He was a warrior, a soldier. Letting him live had been a mistake. That pathetic mercy was the reason why the Korean people would continue to die out. Luca silently cursed the old man, telling him to regret his actions as he watched his comrades continue to fall into the depths of destruction. Ailey, noticing Luca's tense expression, hesitated for a moment before asking with concern why he had closed the eyes of that Korean girl. His voice carried confusion as he slightly lifted his upper body, trying to get a better look at Luca. But Luca did not answer. His eyes widened slightly, as if the question had struck a nerve, but he remained silent. Ailey, now more curious, asked him again, pressing for an answer. Instead of responding, Luca turned his back to Ailey and spoke in a dismissive tone, telling him that he talked too much and sarcastically asking if he had received a new tongue as well. But even as he tried to brush the question aside, his thoughts betrayed his emotions. His mind whispered with regret that what he had done was a mistake. His expression hardened as he made a firm decision. That mistake would never happen again. All the trainees stood in firm positions, their backs straight and their expressions serious as they listened to the officer's announcement. The training grounds were silent except for the officer's commanding voice as he informed them that they had now completed 2 out of the 4 years of their Imperial Guard training. His gaze swept over the group as he reminded them that there were now younger batches joining the ranks. He emphasized that they should act as role models for the new recruits, especially Luca and Ailey, who held the top 2 positions. His voice carried a note of encouragement as he told them that they could even aim to become a centurion. He ended his speech with a strong command, urging them to continue working hard for the glory of the Emperor and his citizens. Luca and Ailey, standing side by side, nodded at the same time and answered in unison, their voices firm as they acknowledged the officer's words. Luca's sharp eyes gleamed with determination as he processed what had just been said. A centurion. His thoughts raced as he recalled how the Imperial Guard was structured. There were 1,000 guardsmen, divided into 10 groups called centuries. Each of these centuries was led by a centurion, but at the very top, commanding all 10, was the chief centurion. This person was not only the highest-ranking officer in the guard but also the centurion of the prestigious first century. The officer then turned on his heel and dismissed them, instructing them to continue their training. Luca, however, remained lost in thought. He knew that cadets like him, once they had completed a full-body mechanization, were assigned to the lowest-ranking unit, the 10th century. His eyes sharpened as he thought about his path forward. If he could become the centurion of the 10th century, he could start climbing higher. If he played his cards right, he could make it big. Luca and Ailey were engaged in a fight practice, their movements sharp and precise. Ailey attacked again and again, his strikes strong, but Luca effortlessly blocked every hit. His sharp eyes studied Ailey's movements closely, noticing how his new arm gave him even more power. Luca's thoughts lingered on how much stronger Ailey had become, but he remained unfazed. He waited for the right moment, then suddenly struck back with a quick kick, throwing Ailey off balance. In that brief moment of distraction, Luca moved in, stopping his punch just inches from Ailey's face. A firm smile played on his lips as he calmly stated that this made 124 rounds and 124 wins. Later that night, Luca and Ailey sat side by side under the dim glow of the stars. The air was cool and quiet, the tension of their fight now replaced with a peaceful stillness. Ailey sighed and admitted that he had really thought he would win this time. There was frustration in his voice, but also acceptance. Luca, his expression steady, reminded him that if getting new body parts was all it took to become stronger, then training would be meaningless. Ailey turned his gaze toward Luca, his eyes thoughtful. He remarked that Luca seemed even more rigid after the officer's speech earlier. The centurion goal had clearly left a strong impression on him. Luca nodded without hesitation, his voice filled with certainty, as he explained that if he gained experience as an Imperial Guard, he would be welcomed anywhere. His ambition was clear. Ailey's eyes fixed on the countless stars above. With curiosity in his voice, he asked Luca why he did not relax a little. He pointed out that Luca had already reached a position where his birth no longer mattered, so there was no need to push himself so hard. Luca's expression remained serious as he replied with the hard truth. Unlike Ailey, he had no home to return to. If he did not keep climbing higher, it would all be over for him. He had no other choice. His sharp gaze turned to Ailey as he added that Ailey had talent, but he lacked the drive to use it. Then, with genuine curiosity, Luca asked why Ailey even wanted to become a guardsman in the first place. Ailey smiled faintly. With a firm but distant tone, he admitted that he had actually wanted to be a scholar, an archaeologist. His true dream was to study the ancient arcane civilization, to uncover its mysteries and understand its past. Luca frowned slightly, confusion flickering across his face. If that was what Ailey wanted, then why did he not just pursue it? His question was straightforward, but Ailey only sighed before turning his head toward him. He explained that studying the arcane civilization was banned in the Empire. No individual was allowed to research it freely. On top of that, his family had already produced multiple generals. His path had been decided for him from the moment he was born. They would never allow him to do anything else. Luca studied Ailey for a moment before speaking again. His tone was blunt as he asked if Ailey was sad simply because he could not do what he wanted. His sharp eyes held no sympathy as he told Ailey that he was spoiled. He reminded him that there were countless people in the slums who were not even guaranteed to survive another day. Many of them were just thankful to have something to eat. Compared to them, Ailey had everything. Luca's words were cold, but they carried the weight of someone who had seen true struggle. Ailey let out a small sigh and spoke with a knowing tone, telling Luca that he had expected him to say that. He reminded Luca that he had just shared a secret with him, something personal that he had never told anyone else. He called Luca his friend, his voice carrying a quiet trust. Luca's expression remained serious as he warned Ailey that some people might take his words as criticism of the Empire. If the wrong person heard him and reported it, his life would be ruined. The Empire did not tolerate disloyalty. Ailey, however, showed no fear. He spoke with confidence, assuring Luca that he would not do such a thing. Just as Ailey had kept Luca's secret, he trusted Luca to do the same. Lucas explained himself. He reminded Ailey that his hesitation back then was only because his opponent had been a non-combatant. If that had not been the case, he would have gone back and finished the kill. His voice was firm as he stated that he was loyal to the Empire and the Emperor because they had recognized his talents. He saw the enemies of the Empire as his own enemies, and that included Ailey if he ever became one. Ailey suddenly moved, slipping in front of Luca. His expression was relaxed as he looked up at Luca with a small smile. With a knowing tone, he called him a liar. If Luca's loyalty to the Empire truly surpassed everything else, then he would have already tried to kill him. His voice softened slightly as he told Luca not to push himself too hard. Then, without waiting for a response, Ailey turned and walked away. Luca stayed in place, his jaw tightening as he clenched his teeth in frustration. His sharp eyes followed Ailey's back as he disappeared into the night. Anger mixed with concern as a single thought echoed in his mind that he was an idiot. You will die if you keep acting like that. The third-year training mission had brought Luca, Ailey, and the other trainees to a vast, uninhabited neutral zone. Their goal was reconnaissance, but Ailey's excitement had already shifted his focus elsewhere. He stood in front of an ancient doorway, his hand pressed against the cold surface. His eyes gleamed with fascination as he announced that it was an arcane site, an ancient remnant of a civilization that existed long before humans. Despite being millions of years old, there was still an energy response coming from within. His voice was filled with wonder as he turned to Luca, asking if he did not find it amazing. He spoke about how civilizations had explored the stars before humans had even existed. Luca remained standing in front of the group, his expression unreadable. A thought crossed his mind that he had drawn clear lines, but Ailey never hesitated to cross them. His fascination with forbidden history, his carefree attitude toward the dangers of the Empire's rules that frustrated Luca. Keeping his voice firm, Luca reminded Ailey not to be careless. This was a reconnaissance mission, part of their training. If they encountered another force out here, it would not be just an exploration but it would be a fight. His warning was clear, but Ailey only shrugged, his smile light and unconcerned. He confidently stated that even if they could not handle an enemy, someone from the Imperial Guard would surely come to help them. Luca's face turned red with frustration, his teeth clenched as he tried to respond. His anger was about to spill over, but before he could say anything, a voice interrupted from behind. A trainee stepped forward with a calm smile, adding his own thoughts to the conversation. He spoke about how the present existed because of the past, and how history allowed people to predict the future. In his view, it made perfect sense why so many were drawn to studying history. The trainee's name was Claude Ramonis, another member of the Accretion Imperial Guard training program. His words carried a quiet understanding, different from Ailey's reckless excitement, yet they both shared a fascination with the past. Luca turned his head toward Claude. He silently observed him, recalling that while Claude's family was not as influential as the Karthikas, they were still well respected. Claude was not just any trainee, he came from a strong background. Claude suddenly spoke, asking if he could ask Luca a question. Luca did not respond with words but simply looked at him with questioning eyes, waiting for him to continue. Without hesitation, Claude stated that he thought he liked Luca, then casually asked if he was seeing anyone. Luca's entire body tensed. His anger flared instantly as he clenched both fists, stepping forward aggressively. His sharp eyes locked onto Claude as he warned him in a cold, firm voice that if he took another step closer, he would consider him a threat. His muscles were ready to fight if necessary. Claude rubbed the back of his head, shaking it slightly as he reassured Luca that there was no need to be so scared. He clarified that if Luca was not seeing anyone, he had only planned to introduce him to his little sister. Luca's tense stance relaxed just slightly as he replied in a flat tone, telling Claude that he was from an orphanage. His words were simple, but they carried weight. Claude gave Luca a carefree smile, telling him that whether he came from an orphanage or nobility, he was still likely to end up as his superior. He then casually suggested that he should think about it because his sister was quite cute. Leaning in slightly, he lowered his voice and teased Luca, whispering that he was quite popular. Luca's patience snapped, and he immediately told Claude to shut up. He had no interest in such things, especially not during a mission. Pushing the conversation aside, he focused on strategy. His voice turned sharp and commanding as he gave orders. There was a biological response detected ahead, meaning potential danger. He ordered Eileen's group to take cover and provide support from the rear while he and Claude would stay in the front. The team moved carefully, their bodies covered for protection as they entered the site. Luca's sharp eyes scanned the area, and then he saw a glowing stone, floating in the air, pulsing with energy. But more importantly, he saw what was standing near it. A robotic armor gleaming stood in front of the stone, gripping a spear tightly in its hand. Luca's instincts screamed at him. His eyes widened as he recognized the warrior in front of them. His thoughts raced. Damn it! That's a Korite paladin! They were powerful warriors, trained and enhanced beyond human limits. Before Luca could react further, the paladin suddenly turned toward them. Without hesitation, it launched an attack. Luca's body moved on instinct as he shouted a single word with urgency: run. But it was too late. The attack struck Claude directly, hitting him with a wave of glowing energy. The force was brutal, sending him backward as blood sprayed from his body. Luca's voice rang out, filled with shock and fear, as he called out his name: Claude? The battle raged on as the spear of the Korite paladin shot forward, piercing through the side door with a bright, glowing energy. With a powerful push, the paladin pulled it back into his grip, his eyes locked onto his next target. Luca stood frozen, his mind replaying Claude's words, spoken with a cheerful smile. He had said he was going to introduce his younger sister if Luca had no woman in mind. But now, as Luca stared at the lifeless body on the ground, his thoughts were filled with shock and disbelief. He had seen the spear glow, but now Claude's upper body was completely gone, leaving behind a horrifying sight. His mechanical eye, the one that always guided him in battle, started to malfunction. It showed an error, refusing to work when he needed it most. Frustration filled his mind as he demanded it to function, to calculate the trajectory of the spear before it was too late. But the error remained, leaving him blind to the enemy's next move. The Korite paladin lifted his spear again, gathering energy in his hand, ready to strike once more. Luca stood still, his body frozen as shock overtook him. Before the paladin could attack, a group of trainees rushed in from behind Luca, their guns firing in desperation. Ailey shouted as he continued to shoot, urging Luca to move. He yelled at him to get it together, to stop standing there and fight. The battle was far from over, and they needed to stall for time. Luca's entire face was covered in sweat as he stared at the Korite paladin, his heart pounding. His thoughts raced as he realized the truth. Ailey was right, but even if he tried to run, escape was impossible. There was no way out of this situation. The only choice left was to fight until the Imperial Guard arrived. If they could just hold on for a dozen or so seconds, he was sure that the Imperial Guard member who had been watching would come to their aid. The timer on his mechanical eye started at 0 and quickly passed to 1 minute 22 seconds. Before he could process his next move, the paladin lunged at him, his spear glowing with deadly energy. Luca reacted as fast as he could, dodging the attack just in time, but the impact still shattered part of the robotic cover on his face. His eyes widened as he felt a sharp pain. This wasn't just about lasting for a dozen seconds. Even a single second felt too long against this monster. A thin cut appeared on his cheek. As the timer reached 2 minutes 25 seconds, the paladin attacked again. Luca barely had time to react. His mind screamed at him as he realized the truth. Was this it? Was he really going to die here? His entire body tensed, and fear crawled up his spine. There was no way he could survive against this powerful enemy for even a dozen seconds. The difference in strength was too great. Suddenly, the loud voice of the commander echoed through the battlefield, cutting through Luca's fear. He shouted at him, comparing him to a helpless animal about to be slaughtered. He warned that turning his back on the enemy would only lead to death. If the enemy swung their blade, then Luca had to do the same. There was no place for weaklings in the Imperial Guard. His words were sharp and commanding, forcing Luca to snap out of his fear. At the timer of 3 seconds, Luca clenched his teeth and gripped his sword tightly. He knew there was no more time to hesitate. Instead of waiting for the paladin to attack, he decided to strike first. With all the strength he had, he rushed forward, determined to land a hit before the enemy could move. As the timer reached to 4 seconds, a sudden explosion shook the battlefield. A thick cloud of smoke covered the area where the paladin had been standing. Eiley's voice rang out in panic as he shouted Luca's name. The battlefield was filled with dust, making it hard to see what had happened. By the time the timer hit 6 seconds, Luca stood, his body covered in wounds. His breathing was heavy, every inhale bringing sharp pain. He could barely move his arm anymore, but he had managed to block the paladin's spear. His body ached, but he was still standing. He clenched his teeth as he looked ahead. The paladin was still in front of him, the cut on his cheek with blood dripping from it. Instead of attacking Luca, the Korite paladin suddenly turned and unleashed his energy on the trainees standing behind him, including Eiley. The attack was so unexpected. Luca's eyes widened as he quickly turned his head, his voice filled with panic as he shouted Eiley's name. His mind raced with confusion. Why had not the paladin attacked him? What was his true aim? Before Luca could process it, the paladin rushed toward him again. Luca saw the deadly approach, his eyes widening before he gritted his teeth and charged forward as well. The paladin was flying in the air, but Luca used a special mechanism in his boots, sparks bursting from them as they gave him the ability to lift off the ground while running. Both warriors closed the distance, ready to strike each other with full force. Just as their weapons were about to collide, a fully armored Imperial Guard arrived in a flash, grabbing the paladin's head from behind with one powerful hand. Without hesitation, he slammed the paladin's head straight into the ground with immense force, sending dust and debris flying everywhere. Luca watched the scene unfold in pure confusion. The Imperial Guard did not stop there. He raised his gun, aiming directly at the paladin's head, and fired multiple times. The powerful shots echoed across the battlefield. Then, with incredible strength, the Imperial Guard, using his flight boosters, dragged him across the ground at high speed. With a final powerful throw, he sent the paladin crashing into the Korite door. The impact was so strong that a massive explosion followed, shaking the surroundings. Luca quickly moved outside, trying to grasp the situation. When he looked at the scene from a distance and finally realized he had been saved by the Imperial Guard, the paladin slowly pushed himself up, his body weak and damaged. He used his sword for support, struggling to stay on his feet. Behind him, the Korite door now had a huge crater-like dent from the force of his crash. The Imperial Guard turned his head slightly, watching the paladin closely. A crack had formed across the mirrored face cover of the paladin's helmet, a clear sign that the battle was not yet over. The battlefield was tense as the paladin leaned heavily on his sword, which was planted firmly in the ground. He struggled to stay steady, gathering all his strength while facing the Imperial Guard, who stood tall in front of him. The Imperial Guard gripped his weapon tightly, as the battle was about to begin. From a distance, Luca watched with confusion, his mind racing with questions. He tried to understand the fight before him. The Imperial Guard wielded the legendary weapon of the Empire, Legion, while the Holy Knight of Korite used the Force. Both were powerful warriors, but Luca could not tell which side was stronger. As the battle started, the two fighters clashed with incredible force, their weapons colliding so fast that it caused shockwaves through the air. Sparks flew, and the sheer speed of their movements made it almost impossible to follow. Luca clenched his teeth, as he realized he could not even track their weapons with his own eyes. The intensity of the fight was beyond anything he had ever seen. Luca felt desperate and silently wished for the Imperial Guard to win, believing that his victory was necessary. As the paladin swung his sword at the Imperial Guard, the impact was so powerful that the guard had no time to react. And the paladin's sword fell away. In an instant, he raised his large hand to his face, gripping it tightly as if trying to regain his vision. The attack had momentarily blinded him. Then the paladin moved his fingers to summon the spear back to him at that moment. A terrifying thought passed through Luca's mind. The Imperial Guard had never faced an opponent like this before. He had no understanding of the speed and power of spear that had just struck him. Luca's mind filled with fear as he clenched his teeth. He realized the terrible truth: if the Imperial Guard died, he would not survive either. Panic rushed through him as he knew he had to do something before it was too late. His eyes darted around until he saw the paladin's spear embedded in the ground. Without thinking, he rushed toward it, and tried to kick it to change its direction so that it doesn't hit the guard. The spear flew through the air toward the paladin, and Luca desperately hoped it would miss. His heart pounded with anger, knowing that this was his only chance. Still, the Imperial Guard held the Paladin's face with one hand while the Paladin struggled, gripping the guard's hand with his own. The battle was intense, but in the middle of their struggle, the Paladin caught the flying spear with his other hand. At that time, the Imperial Guard used all his strength and delivered a crushing punch. The impact was so powerful that the Paladin was slammed into the ground with incredible force. The earth shook from the impact, sending dust and leaves flying into the air. A loud blast followed as the ground cracked under the immense pressure of the blow. After some time, silence filled the battlefield. Luca lay on the ground, his body weak and in pain. His vision was blurry, and when he tried to move, he felt an unbearable pain in his leg. His leg was no longer attached to his body. A deep moan of pain escaped his lips. His sharp eyes searched the surroundings, trying to find any sign of life. He needed to know who had survived. Fear gripped his heart as a terrifying thought entered his mind. If the Korite Knight was still alive, he had no chance of escape. As he tried to process everything, he suddenly heard footsteps approaching, and without thinking, he began to plead for mercy. The sound of footsteps grew louder until they stopped right beside his head. His heart pounded as he heard the familiar voice of the Imperial Guard speaking to him. His voice was strong as he praised Luca, telling him that thanks to his help, he was able to take down the Korite Knight. Then, the guard asked if he had received a wound on his abdomen. Luca, still keeping his eyes closed, replied weakly. He had been injured while trying to dodge the knight's forced slash. Hearing this, the Imperial Guard reached out his hand to him and offered his assistance, telling Luca that they should return to the base. Luca's eyes widened in shock as he stared at the armored warrior before him. His mind raced as he thought about the legendary Legion, the full-body mechanical armor granted by the Empire to their Imperial Guards. This armor removed all weak and unnecessary parts of the body, transforming the wearer into the ultimate weapon. Every trainee dreamed of receiving a Legion, as it was the highest honor and proof of becoming a true Imperial Guard. Luca hesitated and did not take the Imperial Guard's hand. Instead, a disturbing question formed in his mind, and he could not stop himself from asking. He wanted to know the truth. Was the Imperial Guard still human, or was he just a machine? He asked if he was alive despite not having a brain. The Imperial Guard did not reply with words. Instead, he suddenly punched the ground on both sides of Luca with incredible force. The impact was so powerful that the earth shook, and Luca screamed in fear. Then, in a cold, emotionless voice, the Imperial Guard confirmed the terrifying truth that his brain was gone. Luca's body trembled as he whispered to himself in shock. He had spent his whole life training, pushing himself beyond his limits, all to become an Imperial Guard. But now, seeing what the Legion had turned this warrior into, he felt a deep fear in his heart. He had been striving for so long to become something like this, a monster that had lost all traces of humanity. His body trembling uncontrollably. He could not stop shaking since before, and a terrible thought filled his mind. He wondered if he could survive until help arrived. The coldness surrounding him made him feel like this would be the last thing he ever saw in his life. The Imperial Guard sat beside him, silent and unmoving, footsteps as if waiting for something. And Ailey arrived. Suddenly, footsteps approached, holding his own arm with his hand. He was injured, still managed holding his own arm with his hand. But he still managed to smile as he spoke. Luca's eyes widened with relief and weakly responded that he had survived. Luca's eyes widened with relief and weakly admitted that he was not in the best condition. But before he could finish his sentence, Luca interrupted him with urgency. He wanted to know about the others with urgency. Ailey sat down beside him and revealed the painful truth. Ailey sat down beside him and revealed the painful truth. Everyone else was dead. Besides the two of them, voice broke as everyone else was dead. Struggling against the pain in his body. Kuka's voice broke as he spoke. He knew he did not have much time left. He told Ailey that he was going to die soon. Then asked him what he planned to do now. Ailey looked at him with confusion, not fully understanding. Ailey looked at him with confusion, but Luca continued, not fully understanding. He told Ailey to look ahead, but Luca continued, to see that the life he had always wanted was right in front of him. To see that the life he had always wanted was right in front of him. He pointed out that the direction Ailey had been longing for. He pointed out that the direction Ailey had been longing for were within his reach. The lands of Korite and Bellato. Luca reminded him that what he truly wished for could never be found. Luca reminded him that what he truly wished for could never be found. He would be all right, and told him to leave while he still had the chance. Luca knew that once reinforcements arrived, they would have no choice but to return to the Empire. They would have no choice but to return to the Empire. He had to go now. If Ailey wanted to chase his dreams, turning toward the distant lands of Korite and Bellato. Ailey stood up and turning toward the distant lands of Korite. He began walking away, leaving the Empire behind. He began walking away, Ailey's figure growing smaller in the distance. Luca's figure growing smaller in the distance as he looked at his back. Luca's mind filled with everything a background of guaranteed wealth and fame. Ali had everything a background of guaranteed wealth and fame. Any citizen of the Empire would be jealous of him. Any citizen of the Empire would be jealous of him. Luca could not chose to walk away from it all. Ali's choices made no sense to him. But then, he remembered no sense to him. The way Ali had spoken about his dreams had been different. The way Ali had spoken about his dreams had ever seen him shine. It was the brightest Luca had ever seen him shine. Silently wished for Ali to live the way he truly wanted. Silently wished for Ali to live the way he truly wanted. Just as Luca was about to let go of his heart, he suddenly felt something press against his abdomen. His eyes opened in confusion, and he saw Ailey kneeling beside him, placing a white cloth over his wound. Beside him. The cloth quickly turned red as it absorbed his blood. The cloth quickly turned red in disbelief before asking angrily what he was doing. Luca looked at him in disbelief before asking angrily what he was doing. Despite his injuries and the fact that he had only one arm left, he explained that seeing Luca act so weak had made him worry that he might actually die. He could not just walk away knowing that Luca was in this condition. He could not just walk away knowing that Luca was guilt-free if Luca died like this. There was no way he could live guilt-free if Luca died like this. Feeling frustration mixed with relief. Luca sighed deeply. He called Ailey an idiot. Unable to believe how stubborn he was. He called Ailey an idiot. Just unable to believe how stubborn he was. The sound of engines filled the air. Just then, a reinforcement jet appeared above the air, hovering in the sky. A reinforcement jet appeared above them, finally arrived, hovering in the sky.